Alrighty. Thank you all for coming. I'd also like to thank the Faculty of Arts and Design for helping pull this together as well, and also thank you for Ryan. Thank you to Ryan for just agreeing to do it. Take it away.
All right, so it'll record, but only if I'm near this, I assume.
Yeah, that's fine.
Fantastic. All right, so just going to go through some comic things. I'll unpack who I am because realistically you need to care if you're going to really want to invest in what I have to say. So we'll go through some of that for anyone who didn't do the homework and completely study up on me, which is a trick because I don't have a Wikipedia page. So I'll go through that. I'll get into certain sort of granular elements of comics, but I'll also just go over just storytelling in general because from what I can tell you guys are a writing group, so I want to make sure that even if you walk out of here today going, yep, I was right, comics stink, and so do comic writers, and I don't ever want to write one, you could still say, well, I learnt maybe something about story. So let's see how we go. All right, so just a question. So you only have to put up your hand for this one. Is there anybody here who wants to write comics? Cool, hands down. All right. Let the record state everybody's hand went up. Who's published anything so far? Has anyone managed to, in a zine, in the local uni newspaper, anything like that? Oh, we have nascent voices, which is great. Excellent. Facebook posts totally count. That's online publishing. So hands went up everywhere. It was crazy. So why do we tell stories? Okay, so this is going to boil down to that real pure element at the start, just to get our brains warming up. I always find no matter what age I teach, the first 5 minutes people sort of haven't tuned in yet. So why do we tell stories? Please, especially for comics writing, do not say fame. There just isn't any. Nor is that a stimulus for wanting to tell a story, okay? What should a story do? That's the real thing that you need to consider when it comes to any form of writing. It should emote, it should connect, it should engage, and it should entertain. The whole spectrum of emotions and life experiences can be covered under that, but that's what you need to be thinking about. When I think about the stories that I love, it's because they've connected with me in a personal way, and I was talking about that actually just before I came in, about how Pride and Prejudice just did not connect with me. But Pride and Prejudice and Zombies totally did. Okay, so you're going to bring your personal elements of things, and you're allowed to. That should come out in what you write. That should come out in what we call your authorial voice. Okay, so you need to consider, what do you want emoting out of your story? How do you want to connect? With whom? How are you going to engage, and how will it entertain? Okay, so you can think about the sort of things that you like. I like to think about the fiction that I like and why it works. I love to think about the fiction that I don't like and that doesn't work for me. Shout out to Michael Bay and all his Transformers movies. They just don't connect, emote, engage, which for me means they don't entertain. Of course they can, and that's your bag, but you need to think about what it's doing. So what have you done so far? I'm assuming as a writers group, we had a few hands go up to say we've published stuff, but I'm assuming we've written things. And I'm going to let that be the broader spectrum, whether it's screenplays, poems, Facebook posts, of course, novels, short stories, a thesis, whatever the case may be. I'm assuming you've written, but this idea that was taught to me years and years ago is that you have to write about 10,000 pages of just pure, utter street trash. Okay, that first stuff you're going to write is going to be horrible, holistically speaking. Within there might be good pages. Within there might be cool characters, interesting scenes. You might be better than me and your first novel is amazing. That is absolutely possible, and looking around the room, probable. But feel free to write and write and write, knowing that it doesn't need to be published, adapted, loved, award-winning. You just need to write to start off with and just get those wheels moving. I always talk about it as being like you want to run a marathon. You don't just get up one day and be like, can't wait to run a marathon in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go, and then you take off. You train, you have training sessions in the rain, you fall, you hurt yourself, you wait 6 months and then you attempt one and then your time stinks and then you do it again later, and it's a process. If you are really serious about your writing, it will be a lifelong process. And that's not me giving you a life sentence. That's a good thing. That's me opening up life for you and the writing that will come from it. Now, A to the Q, of course, if at any stage you have a question, I do want you just to pop up your hand. I do want you to interrupt me. I do want you to question anything that I might be saying. I would love any interactivity. I welcome it. I love a good tangent. I love to get off topic. So feel free at any stage, if you see something up there and you think it's rubbish, tell me. If you're not sure about it, tell me. If you've got a connection to make, by all means tell me. I absolutely don't mind. In fact, I would love it. Okay? So, who am I? Okay? Let's take just a few minutes. I'll go through it quick. I love talking about myself, but I'll go through it quick. All right, so starting off, I always knew I'd be a writer. I can remember standing up in art class in year 3 and saying I'm going to be a writer and a teacher when I grow up. And it took about 30 years, but I'm published and I teach year 4, so I sort of managed to make it, which was really good. I wrote intermittently through school. High school, I wrote short stories here and there. I wrote different things. Never really committed. I was great at starting stories. I was great at having ideas, which is fine. There's that Aragorn book written by a 16-year-old. That guy's the exception. That guy's the outlier. You don't need to compare yourself to that person. You need to think about what you're doing. So spitball, come up with 100 ideas. Be more like Seth Rogen, who came up with like 100 ideas as a late teen, and then eventually, a decade later, turned one into Superbad, which is obviously the pinnacle of cinema. So it wasn't until about 2004, after I'd graduated uni, in fact, and I'd written a bit at uni. Had gone into university. I went to university up in Armidale in New South Wales, and went in a few writing competitions there. Nothing serious. And it was only when I started teaching that I bought a laptop and my first tax return and actually took the writing seriously. And from there, 2008, I take it a little bit more seriously. Whether that coincides with me meeting my wife and actually having real-world inspiration is debatable, but she's pretty certain that it's a fact. But if I got that laptop in 2004, I didn't really publish my first comic pages until 2012. Now, I don't draw, so that was a bit of a hindrance for me. I couldn't quite just make a comic, because when I say I can't draw, it's like the Fonz trying to say sorry. It just doesn't come out. The Fonz reference doesn't work for this age group. My apologies. So I had to wait for collaborators, which was good, because it meant I wrote my 10,000 pages of really horrible comics. And they were, and I've gone back and looked at them, and they're worse than I remember. They aged poorly. And so it wasn't until 2012 I did a short story in an anthology by my local, we in Canberra, we have a comic drink and draw. The first Sunday of every month we meet at Reload and just have a chat. We call it a drink and draw, but I can't draw and I'm still allowed to attend, so anybody can go. So I did that, and then I followed it up with a 22-page creator-owned one-shot called Fatherhood. So that was my first comic with my name on the title that I came up with, and we released it in 2013. Again, writing through the 90s. I am considerably older than most of you, sadly. Writing through the 2000s. Take it seriously. Progressively more each year, but I didn't publish my first comic until 2013. So I want you to allow that to give you that idea that it doesn't need to happen instantly. It may not, and it may, and then great, you've done better than I have, but it can take a while. Now, in that same year, I don't think I've put an image up for it. Oh, I did. I wrote a My Little Pony one-shot. I don't really want to get into it, but I just thought I'd put it out there. It was an opportunity I got from an editor, and I didn't really know what My Little Pony was, and investigated, and it was fun, and it was right around the time my daughter was being born, so I thought, well, I'll give it a crack. Really interesting stuff, and it stretched me as a writer, which was great, but you'll notice the future publications I talk about really don't skew that way. So I finally started to get publication, and that's when it started to snowball. I'd written probably 60 different comic scripts. I'd written a ton of stuff. I'd written 4 novels. I'd written about a dozen good short stories, a few other really crummy short stories. I'd written all sorts of things. But then I finally, and comics was the niche I always wanted to get into, I landed that. Then I had a book called Headspace. And I got that picked up, and we released it in 2014 digitally, and we eventually got it picked up by IDW, which is a comic publisher in the States, and we released it in 2015. Notice that it's not months clipping by, it's years. And it is a slow progress. You keep writing during that time, but things slowly come out. I had other short stories. I had a book, Kickstarter, helped me fund the first issue of a book called Dear Editor, which is about the editor of a crime beat at a newspaper who's also a deer. So we have the deer guy on the left. Nobody cares that he's a walking deer, and a journalist at the same time. And so I was able to fundraise money through crowdfunding that way. That is a great way to go. People allow themselves to have that mixed bag of success and failure. If you get your book kickstarted, it doesn't have to be perfect like I would expect a Batman comic to be. If Batman comics have been through enough hands, it should be damn good by this stage. Book on Kickstarter that's someone's second thing that they wrote, I expect it to be enjoyable. but it doesn't have to be perfect. So it's a good avenue to sort of look towards going down. Eventually I got picked up by Vertigo, which is like the creator-owned imprint of DC. And so that started to spin more wheels, and then I had a book called Negative Space picked up by Dark Horse Comics, who publish Hellboy and a lot of things like the Aliens and Predator comics. And that was really good, and over the last year we won the Aurealis Award for Speculative Fiction in Australia and won a Bronze Ledger, which is the Comic-Centric Australian Awards. So again, this is the awards that I won a few months ago in 2017 for a book that was published initially in 2015, released in trade in 2016, that I wrote mostly in 2014. We're talking a fairly decent timescale. I had another book come out a year and a half ago called Chum, which is like a surf noir crime story. And then I'm currently in the middle of releasing Beautiful Canvas, a miniseries about a hit woman who sort of enters an existential crisis because she's hired to kill a small child, but in the same week finds out her girlfriend's pregnant and starts to think, you know, am I a bad person? So it's the first time a hit woman's ever thought that clearly. So now this is being published, 2 issues are out and 2 issues are still to come. So we're moving along throughout the years, but things are coming along. Last year, the DC Comics publisher decided to hold an international talent hunt. And I think about 2,000 people applied, and they selected 8 people for the writers program to study under their A-list writer Scott Snyder, who's been writing Batman for the last 5-6 years. I was lucky enough to be selected for that and worked in that program for 13 weeks, and I'm now working with DC Editorial about what comes next and discussing with them where I might land. So I say all of that mostly just to brag, and I like to hear it, but also just so that you know, who's this clown who teaches year 4? Oh, he does do a little bit on the side as well. So I just want to make sure that you have faith in what I'm saying today. So throughout all of that, it's important to realize that in between all of those gigs, I had projects that started and then failed. I had things that I wrote. I had things that I wrote that are yet to be released, are going to be released. I'm still pitching, or I've been picked up with publishers. You don't get one thing and then just sort of sit on it. You keep it spinning over. And especially at this stage with university, you should be thinking about just ideas, getting the tank full and working on those things. Now, I very quickly want to go through the writing process curriculum guide, which is what I think about when I write comics. I'll blast through it, and for those who I get the email to share this with, I want you to track down some of these things. They're books that might help you, they're ideas and resources that may help you with story in general, but also comics specifically. So there's one called Understanding Comics. Okay, it really is, it should be the first thing you read, and then it should be about the 5th thing you read, and then you should come back to it every 18 to 24 months, because you will constantly be a better writer who is able to understand what it is telling you. It's by Scott McCloud, and it just explains everything about how comics work. You guys look pretty savvy, and I'm sure you would go, well, comics just work. But the amount of people that come up to me and go, this is cool, how do I read it? Like it's some sort of hieroglyph, and you have to teach them how to go through the page and what panels do. Children intuitively do it so naturally because they're so smart, and adults just seem to have lost it and go, oh, I don't know what to do with this. It's not moving, but it's not words. What do I do? This book unpacks it in a way where you aren't teaching how to read it, but you're teaching how to control it in the reader. It's fantastic. It goes through things like you can see here, and I'll get to it later, how panels work, and the idea of you can see one panel and a second panel, totally disparate locations, but they're following on from each other. And in between, we have the gutter. And what happens in the gutter there is called closure. And that's what the reader does. The reader in between goes, I bet that guy got chopped with the axe because he's screaming, so that makes sense. And another reader might go, oh, I bet he gets chopped, but he's not dying. He's probably just got a bit of a flesh wound, and so they fill in the story. You as a writer need to control that. Every word, every image, every story turn needs to be you holding the strings, controlling your reader at every single turn. This book is great at showing you how to do that. Will Eisner's Comics and Sequential Art. Will Eisner was a very famous artist from, we're closing in on him starting nearly a century ago. And his book, it comes at it from a more art-based perspective. So again, not as helpful for me, but really helpful for when I write scripts for artists. I didn't ask earlier, is there anybody in the audience who fancies themselves as a drawer, an illustrator, as somebody who can possibly create their own comics? A handful of hands go up. Cool. All right, well, that book would definitely be for you. So there's one that was released recently by Michael Bendis, who has written at Marvel for the last 15 odd years, has written basically every movie-tied character at this stage. They seem to put him on the big blockbuster books. He wrote a book about not just how to make comics, but that idea of how to collaborate, how to work within the system, how to work within the business of it. Phenomenal book. There's some really good chapters in there about just how to get things done. Definitely worth tracking down. Stephen King on writing. By this stage, I love that it's a cliche to bring this one up because it just really is that damn good. And it's good because it's so casual, which is Stephen King's talent when he talks to you through his words. He has such a beautiful author's voice, and it just unpacks ideas without you really seeing it. It's very much not a didactic book, as opposed to Robert McKee's Story. I have my issues with this book. I love this book in certain ways. Its character development is fantastic. Its strict adherence to 17 minutes into your screenplay, somebody will poop their pants, isn't quite what you need in a story. You need to break the mold. You need to find new ways to tell a story. And especially in comics, it doesn't work the same. So the structure stuff in there isn't quite personally like what I attach to in the book, but its character-based stuff is quite good, and it gives you that basis, which some of you have probably already read that book. There's a little one called Alan Moore's Writing for Comics. It's like this big rant essay he did that was so good that they deemed it publishable, which is interesting, because the guy is pretty crazy, but he's also crazy smart, so you get to have that balance when you're there. And Pixar's 22 Rules for Phenomenal Storytelling. It's all over the internet. You can find it in a variety of GIFs and shapes and forms. It is worth tracking down because, they have been telling some of the best stories for the last few decades, but there is a system to a lot of what they do. And so I've got a link in there. And there's this download analysis PDF thing that I found that sort of maps each of the 22 things with different stories, specifically how it was done. Really handy guide just to get and hold on to and scrub through. And then the last thing I always sort of think about with stories is the 5-act structure. I tend to go with this more, especially with comics, because you're breaking stories up into issues more often than not, unless you do a graphic novel. But even then, the 5-act structure really works because it sort of breaks things up a little bit more and it gives you more specificity. So basically the first act of a 3-act structure would be acts 1 and 2, and then the middle act remains the same, and then we get the final 2 acts spreading out from what would be act 3, and so it becomes a really handy way. Shakespeare used it and it worked quite well, so we figure he knew what he was doing. So there's a link there to a site that has all this great unpacking of how 5-act is already working in all the movies that we love. And so like there's inciting incident, so you want to kick your story off. So you want to have something that happens. Then you want to have a lock-in, and this is where most movies that don't work don't have a lock-in for the character where they make a choice and then they can't turn back. There's no good your character going, there's Nazis out there and I'm going to have to fight them. And they step outside and they go, oh, it's pretty chilly, I'm going to go back inside. Story's over and your story is rubbish. So you need to have this lock-in where it's like, oh, my child was just kidnapped by the Nazis. Probably going to lock myself into this path and go and rescue my child and kick some Nazis in the head. So you want that lock-in, then there's the first culmination, a big turn, then you have the main culmination, which is usually best served when it's the lowest point for the character, and then they can springboard into that 3rd act twist. So it's nothing totally revolutionary, but it hopefully unpacks that story, and it's something you can come back to, especially that visual, and map your story over it and go, all right, where do I think pieces are happening? And then you can just sneeze on them and make them move like Christopher Nolan no doubt does, but get them into a semblance of them making sense across the story. So I sort of had a look at the Captain America movie and how the structure works there, so people can sort of get into that. It's an example from the website, and you can see that structure totally works, and same with 7, which really is just a perfect story and screenplay, totally worth looking into. So we're here to talk specifically about comics though, so hopefully we've spent the minutes now warming your brains up about story. Everybody's sort of in that groove and feeling it. I want to get really into the comics aspect of it. So if you want to write a comic, you're going to have to write script. Has anybody ever written film or TV script before? A little bit? Some of you would know then the structure that they have and how very strict they are, to the point where if you were to submit a movie script and it wasn't in the right structure, it gets tossed in the can before anybody actually looks at it. It's insane. Comics is the opposite, which is totally awesome, because then you can kind of tweak your script structure, but then it's also maddening because you never know what's right or what somebody might be expecting. But we're going to look at how it works. So writing a comic script, it's hard. Anyone can do it, and there's lots of ways to do it. Okay, so we'll go through a few of those. Wait for the tab. So there's no set standard, which is good. Here's one. This was the first real comic script that I found. It would have been back in about 06 or 07. I printed it off and I hung it next to my desk so that I could just constantly get it embedded how you write that comic script. So as you can see, you've got page at the top, so you know what comic page you are writing in the story. It seems obvious. Then you break it up into panels, and you can see they're numbered in this specific script, just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The artist has made notes to help them sort of put it into a visual, so they've sort of mapped out where each of the different panels are. Then you've got a rough description of what's going on in the panel. You want to talk about location, you want to talk about characters, obviously, you want to talk about emotion. What you don't want to do, and especially from me, who is a visual dunce and just does not draw, you don't want to start to say, we're looking overhead because we're going to be able to see, like, don't tell the artist what to draw. That's a really big thing. You might have a very specific story reason for it, but otherwise don't start mapping out camera angles, because there isn't a camera really. You can use that film shorthand in your scripts, but don't start saying it needs to be a mid-tier shot of the character crying as they look out a window. Just say the character is looking out the window thinking about their son who was kidnapped by Nazis and now they're really upset. Maybe have a tear on their cheek. If you are working with a good artist, or if you are a good artist, for the few people who put their hands up, they will know what that panel should look like. Should it be wide? Should it be tall? Should it be a circle? Should it be right on the face? Should it be through the window from outside? Should it be from behind and in the reflection you can see the tear on the cheek? I would never write that, because telling an artist to draw a reflection of a character is a horrible thing to make somebody do. But you can get that idea across through the emotion on the panel, and your artist will go, I know how to express this emotion really well. So you get the panel description. Then if there are any words to appear on the page, out of mouths or in captions, you pop them in under each panel description. Hopefully that makes sense. Yes, question? Yeah. It really does depend. You read enough comics, you start to know what'll work. And there's different ways to lay out pages. So there's like a 6-panel grid is really standard, where it would just be sort of 3 and 3, thinking vertically, or an 8-panel grid, so 4 and 4, or a 9-panel grid, which is 3, 3, 3. They're the really standard, old school. They work, not necessarily for every scene and story, or even character type, but they work. If you start to do odd numbers, you're basically saying that one of those panels will probably be a full tier. And so you'd be saying, well, if there's like a big establishing shot, you might want it as a full tier up the top, and then you might have a 4 grid underneath it. Unless I have a very specific reason for it, I, one, won't map out what's full tier or what's not. I will sometimes, but it's generally not going to happen. The other thing I always say to my artists is, if I wrote this and it says 6, they would know already, if they want to draw it as 5 and the story still moves and everything's clear, go for it. If they want to tell it in 9 panels, go for it. And in Beautiful Canvas, which is down there, the artist I work with, Sami Kavela, is a guy in Finland, does it all the time. Pretty much any number of panels that I've put on a page, he's changed it. And he's changed it for a reason. So I always, it's the 4th thing we've done together. I get out of his way at this stage. A smart artist will know how many panels it will need. But you can sometimes think to yourself, oh, well, I mean, Bullseye, like the Bullseye character in Marvel, one of Daredevil's villains. If you wanted to set a page out as a bullseye, you could offer that to the artist. It would be incredibly hard for them, but it might be really story specific. You could give it a go, but I would say the caveat is the artist can say no. They can turn around and say, no, that's not going to work for me. Going to the extreme is I wrote a 24-page one-shot for an artist in Canada. He drew Headspace for him and I to collaborate on, just something short that we could bash out and maybe kickstart. So he broke it down into rough page layouts. We call those thumbnails. And it was 44 pages. And his email just said, oh yeah, some of those scenes were really good. I thought I'd stretch them out a bit. I read through it and it read beautiful. So I said, yeah, sure, we'll just break things up. It's a really moody, shield maiden Viking story. So it worked. I trust him. Him and I are on the same page. Every now and then you might get a collaborator that just botches it. But you just hope that doesn't happen. But yeah, that's a really good question. No, that's all right. So we'll look through a few others. So there's like getting up nice and tight to it. Use it as the rough guide. There's a few other examples here. So you can see, sorry, breaking down the panel, we've got that caps up the top. Tell me what the page is. I often tell you how many panels in the page up the top as well, because then you start reading and you go, oh, okay, this is going to be 4 panels. I can imagine each of them large. Oh, this is going to be a 12-panel grid. Oh, I can imagine them all small. State the panel number, panel description, and then dialogue. And we generally indent that for the letterers who put it in onto the art. So here's another example of a script there where you can see it doesn't say, no, it does say panel, sorry. It says page 2 up the top, panel 1, and then it has a lot of writing. But it's unpacking a location in what I believe is what we call a splash page with one big panel. So it's trying to set everything up. So while that is a lot of writing, I think it's mostly fair to the artist. This was written by Brian Michael Bendis, who illustrated a lot of his early work, so he kind of does get how it should work on the page. Casanova. Has anybody read the comic Casanova? It's one of the best comics of all time, and it's phenomenal, so check it out. Especially, not just is it amazing and thoroughly enjoyable to read, but as a writer, you will take so much from it. It's so incredibly inventive and smart. As a comic, it knows it wants to play with the comic form. I love this book, and I've read it many, many times. Script here you can see is pretty standard. So it's got the page, it talks about panels. So that 1.1 means page 1, panel 1, page 1, panel 2, page 1, panel 3. That's really annoying when you edit in a panel and then you have like 2 page 1, panel 3s, and then you've got to change everything. So I don't get too finicky with the numbers because I know I'm going to change it later. But you can see here it's all pretty clear. Captain America, this one got an Eisner, it was a short story. This one, it bolds certain elements of the description just so that you know they're the important part. Or so the artist, I should say, because your script is for the artist. They know what's important there. We need a coffin, we need a flag, we need 6 soldiers, duty fatigues. You can just bounce through that and still know what you're drawing if you're an artist. So that one works pretty well. They've numbered the captions and things. That's for the letterer. Some publishers will ask for that. It's a massive pain in the ass. Scalped, which is another book. It's like a crime book set on an Indian reservation, and it's phenomenal. Again, has a similar vibe on it. Watchmen. Yeah, this beast. This is Alan Moore, who that's not a splash page either. That's just one panel. He goes in. I mean, his last novel was something like 1,000 pages. The guy just writes and writes and writes. And he doesn't know how to edit. I mean, he's a genius. So again, you've got to allow it, but I would hate to read that if I was an artist, because you can see way down the bottom of the 2 captions that fit in. So the artist had to read all of that. But at the top, if you also do read it, all right, I'm psyched up. I got blood over my elbows, veins in my teeth, and my helmet, knee pads secured, fastened. He's just psyching himself up as well as the artist. It's very much like an email, a letter. It's a conversation between the two, which is kind of cool. I don't know. I don't have the energy to write that much, unfortunately. Or I save a lot of that for the actual emails or discussion you have with your collaborator. You'll notice also the highlighting is what the artist highlighted based on what he needed to draw. So he just said he ignored the rest. So make of that what you will. This was a script by me. So again, you can see this is pretty much my format, and it's what works for me. You can see I bold the panel numbers as words so that I can really break it up in the page. Despite not being able to draw, I do admit I see visually sometimes, and this certainly helps. And I knock those captions and the lettering in. It's all different, okay? As long as you follow that method of state the page so you know where you are, and you don't hand in a script with 2-page 19s, which even the pros do, unfortunately. State the panel number, panel description, and then the dialogue. The more you do this, the more you'll figure out what needs to be there and what does not need to be there. But you need to do it a few times. A really good exercise that Matt Fraction actually talks about is take a comic you love, read it, and then write the script based on the pages that you read. He talked about doing it with Batman Year One, which was published in the 80s. It was written by Frank Miller and drawn by Dave Mazzucchelli. And it's phenomenal. It's probably my favorite Batman story of all time. You take each page and you go, what would the script of that look like? How would you ask an artist to do what eventually ended up on the page? And it's such a cool little, you can take 3 pages of that and write it, and you'll start to realize, here's what you need in your script for panel descriptions. Here's the important stuff to get across. So think of those things, and you'll do all right. No questions about script structure? It's mostly boring stuff, but it gets it across. All right, script toolbox. Let's just go through a few elements that do come into other, I guess, mediums as well, but can be very specific to comics. So looking at dialogue. Okay, this one isn't just comics. Is what the characters say authentic and necessary as well? Now, I use that term necessary because I've been watching a lot of Taylor Sheridan movies lately. He wrote Hell or High Water and he wrote Wind River, which is at the movies now and is phenomenal. He has these just big scenes where characters connect and emote and talk. They would make wickedly boring 10 pages of comics though, but they work in film. He can have them stew over a lot of words until they eventually get to what needs to come out. Sometimes in comics you can't. So I've been looking at his stuff and reading his screenplays, trying to think to myself, how do I get that level of emotion, which he's phenomenal at getting at? His movies are so damn good. How would I get that but on a comic page? So how would I truncate the dialogue to being just what's needed? How would I cut to the quick of what I'm trying to get across? So if you're constantly asking yourself, is what your character's saying authentic to them? Do not have all your characters talk like you. Okay? Yeah, and you will initially, and that's okay. Like I said, you've got 10,000 pages of characters talking in your voice before you start getting good. But is it authentic to them and their experience? And is it necessary either for their character arc or for the story in general? You can sometimes have it to be tone setting where they're just talking about things and it tells you about the world. That can be okay, but sometimes you just need to, especially in a comic, and most comics are 22 pages per issue. Most comic miniseries, anywhere between 4 to 6 issues. You have limited real estate, so consider these things. Are they just saying things to push the story forward? And you'll know when they're doing that because there wasn't anything that really they needed to be saying or should say, but you needed the story to get them to go outside of the room. So the character just sort of says, look, let's keep talking about it, but let's do it out there. Why? No, what you need to do is them go, dear Lord, a snake, get out of the room. And then when they get out of there, they're like, no, Nazis, why? Why with the Nazis every time? So you need to have a reason for them to move. You can't just have them be like, oh, yeah, all right, let's just walk over in the shadows over there. Oh, I got stabbed by a mugger in the shadows. What a shock. Don't have them lazily get there. Make sure they're having something to say. So your characters should each sound different. You're going to have to write a lot in your character voices to get them to eventually have a voice. You're at uni, you have the perfect opportunity just to listen to people and to develop an ear, whether it's at the cafe, whether it's at the pub, whether it's if you live on residence, whether it's in lectures. Don't talk while I'm doing it, but during other people's lectures, just go crazy. You want to hear people and what their voice is like, the way they talk, the words they use, the way they go about going for things. Watch people ask for a favor and then think to yourself, okay, how would I show that on a comic page? Because you've got body language, you've got words that they use, words that they don't use. It's all really helpful stuff. Feel free to give your characters different things to fill their speech balloons. I'm going to make a bit of a leap and say, some of you as writers are probably exploring that idea of character voice and how to formulate it into story. Let's think about the one thing that comics can do that realistically, let's say, film can't. Punctuation. You can have punctuation and just punctuation in the speech balloon in a comic. We want you to think outside the box. This was a page from a comic that I did online. And so you can see here we have a boy. Maybe he's saying something, maybe he just doesn't know the words to say, maybe he's got nothing to say. You can see then we cut to a scene of, the art obscures it a little bit, but somebody laying down on their back, they're not in a good state, and we have this sort of like, almost like cloudburst coming out of them. It's no known form of punctuation, but it's a motive. We have him looking down, skull and crossbones. Is he saying, like, you're about to die? Death is upon you? Is he saying something else that's much more beautiful? You get to fill that in. We cut back to the boy in the room. Still doesn't really know what to say. We have the man back in the scene with the person dying, expressing love, feeling love. Again, the words don't need to be important. Then we cut back to the boy. Never found the words. Dad walks away and his heart is breaking. Okay? Now, I do that because you can play with comics. They're totally fun. Like, you can do something like that and show so much emotion without finding the specific words. Or maybe you have such specific words from your life that you don't want to have to put them on the page. Or maybe like me, you're lazy and you just didn't want to write anything. It's totally up to you. I kind of stole trying this from, I'm going to go back to it, Casanova, there's this awesome funeral sequence. And a bunch of characters get into a heated argument. It's family at a funeral, and it gets messy, and then they end up having a fight. And Matt Fraction wrote it, and then he wrote it again, and then he wrote it again, and he went through drafts and drafts, and he couldn't quite nail it down. He gets the art in, because sometimes you just say, oh, I'll write the exact words, maybe when I see the people. So he gets the art in, and he realized what he needs to do, and I stole it for the first panel and the fourth panel. He had everybody in the panels, the art showed them like screaming at each other and being upset and emoting, and he had all these balloons, big balloons that would have been full of words, completely empty. And what you do is you read that sequence and you just sort of go, oh yeah, I don't know about you, but that's my family. Absolutely, and you connect with it in such a way that if he had gone really specific, where it's like, I can't believe you invited the Nazis in, you'd be like, well, I don't really know any Nazis, so I can't really connect completely with this, which is harder to say today than it used to be a few years ago. So, I'm not going to get political. So, that idea of let your audience connect with what's there, it can happen with what they're saying specifically or what they're not saying. So feel free to use that idea completely. Steal it. I did, so steal it from me. Captions. So captions are not what's coming out of the mouth, but they're sort of like what sticks on the page. We've all seen them when we read comics years ago. They can be non-diegetic, which is setting the scene and the time. It might say Paris, 2014, or it might say Billy's room, yesterday, or it could set something else up. Inner monologue, which is kind of replacing the old whoop, whoop, whoop thought balloons, which apparently are not cool anymore, which sucks because I think they're awesome. You can have a caption that's the inner monologue. I've been chasing this guy for weeks, but I can't seem to get a hold of him, and you have like the detective walking through a rainy street. It's like voiceover in a film. And then you can have the omniscient narrator. He had been tracking him for weeks, and he didn't know what to do next. Omniscient narrator's good because they get to know everything in the story. He didn't realize the killer was right around the corner. It's harder to do in the thought balloon. Been tracking this guy for weeks, but I don't know he's around the corner. It's not quite going to sing. So it depends on what you want to give the audience. Remember what I said way back 35 minutes ago? You're in control. You pull the strings of the reader. Do you want them to know that this guy's walking down a street and the killer's around the corner? And then you go into a flashback for 10 pages and you leave the reader hanging? That's up to you. That's your decision. And so you get to do that with however you present the story. When you start thinking about writing a comic page, write it in all three ways. Write it with just some captions that just give you the information and location. Write it with internal thoughts. Write it with no internal thoughts. Write it with an omniscient narrator. Write it without it. Write it with only speech. And you'll start to see how it works in different ways. And you'll start to see what you prefer or what the story needs. None's right or wrong. There's better and worse. But there's no real right or wrong. There's just what works for that story and what works for you. If we all just sat down separately right now and each wrote a 5-page Transformers comic, some of us would come up with different tools, some of us would come up with utter crap, some of us would come up with masterpieces, and it would all be different and it would all depend on what we used. And if one person made a masterpiece using an omniscient narrator, somebody else could make a steaming pile using omniscient narrator. So you have to remember, don't just see somebody else work with it and go, oh, it worked for them. That's what works. No, that's what worked for them in that story. So do feel free to mix it up. All right, silent panels. We're writers, and every time there's a silent panel, there's no words, which means us and our precious egos don't appear. Okay, it's heartbreaking, it's the worst thing that can happen to you, but you will eventually get to the point where you are happy to write silence. You still write the script, you still write the panel descriptions, you still guide the story, and you'll be happy that you're not there. You'll work it out eventually, okay? So don't be afraid to use them. And that's the sort of thing you can't do in, let's say, a novel. You can't just turn the page and be like, oh, cool, 2 blank pages. This is getting awkward. I think there's a printing problem here. It's not going to work, but in a comic, you still get the visuals, and you can just dial yourself down sometimes, which I do verbally all the time, totally silent, all the time. So, consider the symmetry of the page, though. If you had, let's say, the 6-panel grid, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then, well, technically it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If all of these panels have captions and thought balloons and people speaking, and all of this page doesn't, your page is weighted this way, which might be good if it's flashback now, flashback now, flashback now, because you'd be weighed down by the flashback. But if it's not, it can look off. It can look all right, but it's something to consider. Your comic page is a design. It's a whole element that sits together, and you want to think about its weighting and where the eye is guided through and how it all works. So consider that. Gutters. That aspect that I spoke of earlier, they're the spaces and the gaps between the panels. They are like the most important thing that you get to control sometimes. They are what can sometimes escalate a story from being good to being really great. They can also, you totally miss a bunch of information and they can make your story unreadable. So again, it's a double-edged sword. So they let the readers assume what's happening. So I've got, and it means you don't need to do ABCD storytelling, which is, I write a character that wakes up, which is like the worst way to start a story. They wake up, they look at their phone, and they go, oh, I've got to get to the hospital. So they go and they get in their car and they start driving for the hospital. So what do I show? Panel 1, alarm goes off. Panel 2, they sit up. Panel 3, they look at their phone. Panel 4, they read what's on their phone. Panel 5, they say out loud to nobody in the room, guess I'm needed at the hospital. Because that happens in so many stories where people just narrate what they're doing. It's crap. Then they go and they grab their keys in panel 6. I think I'm up to 6 now. Panel 7, they're walking out the door. Panel 8, they grab their coat, so you know it's cold. Then panel 9, they're driving away. Or even panel 9, they're opening the car door. Panel 10, they're putting the key into the ignition. Panel 11, your artist just stabbed you in the face because you are writing a ridiculous page. You could just as easily have the car driving on the road. First panel. Who cares if they just woke up? Panel 2 could show them rubbing their eye like this, and you go, oh, they're tired. Whatever. You could have them still in their pajamas. Find a different way to do it, but don't just sort of have, here's what they did. They grabbed the spoon, then they dunked the spoon in the cereal, then they lifted it up, then they put it in their mouth, then they chewed it, then they said aloud, Wheat Bix are good. Boring. Super boring. Find a better way to cut through it. So with the gutters, you can do that. You could have the character asleep in bed. Next panel, you can have the character eating cereal while they think of something perhaps, and then the next panel you can have them driving. I'm not going to read that page and go, it was interesting, but I didn't get it when he teleported into his moving car. I thought he was eating breakfast. I just got really confused. No child is going to think that. No reader of right mind is going to think that. They're going to go, he was eating breakfast and then he was in a driving car. I bet he grabbed his keys. They're going to go through the logical line. They're not going to say, I bet he went around the corner and stabbed his neighbor, stole their keys, drove that car around the corner, ditched it, flamed it, ran, caught a bus to the other car that they left behind the CIA headquarters, and then they were driving to go get a McMuffin. No one's going to go that random. They're going to make the nice logical connection, and whenever there's a logical connection, whack it in the gutter, which is the invisible space where your reader will go, they probably put on some shoes and went to the toilet and brushed their teeth because it was after breakfast and grabbed their keys. All that stuff's boring as batshit, so skip it. Absolutely skip it and cut to what is interesting, what tells me about the character, the story, or the world, or all three at the same time. You can have the character driving really fast. That tells me about them. In a really awesome car, like a muscle car, like a real, like beat up though, but old Mustang Shelby. Okay, so that tells me more about the character and their lifestyle choices. And then above the car, you could have like a pterodactyl coming down. Okay, and you'd be like, oh, I think I understand this world. It's a little different from ours. One picture can do that. You don't need to start setting it out A, B, C, D, E, F, G to the end. Okay, so I present you 2 pages, both from Beautiful Canvas. Where I like to think that I have used panels in different ways, both to specific effect. First page on the left, we have a boy ascending stairs, we have a boy looking up at a building. What's that in the clouds? Yes, it is a dragon, so we know about the world, okay? Then we have him knocking on a door. Logical connection between those 2 panels is, we haven't told you that we're changing scene or character. He walked into the building and went to room 515, and he's knocking on the door. I didn't need to show you him entering the room, walking up the stairs, waiting for the elevator, whatever. You just cut across to it, then the door opens. I didn't need to show you Asia on the other side, turning the door handle, opening it. All that stuff's boring and you will assume it. So we have right there, between panels 1, 2, 3, and 4, a fair amount of closure going on for you, but a lot between panels 2 and 3. Okay, because I assume, I believe rightfully so, you were all smart enough to get it. If we look on the page on the right, however, I scripted it so that we have Lon on the right, who is the hit woman, and we have the mother on the left, who she is about to kill. Okay, she hasn't been sent to kill her, but she decides to anyway, because it'd be fun, I guess. So we have her standing there, And then we have a panel where she's shooting her. Now, unfortunately, the mother is not of a stable mind. And there is a little white, see that knife on the bench there? Right next to it is a little white bag of powder, unfortunately. And so this mother's not in a good state. And instead of throwing the knife, she throws a carrot because she thinks that's going to defend her. And it doesn't. And so then we have Lon putting the gun away as the mother hits the ground. You'll notice there, I've almost gone in between A, B, C, D storytelling. It's like A, B, A, C. It is a very short amount of time. We have done that to show you the body language of Lon. Does she look like she cares that she just killed a person? No. Was it easy? Yes. So we're telling you about the character and the world that she inhabits. We're telling you about the other character as well and their choice of reaction. Now that's what I scripted. I actually scripted her standing there still, looking, her shooting, and then her already in the motions of putting the gun away before the body has hit the floor. You'll see that Sammy has added 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 extra panels in the middle. He did that to control your eye, control the pace, control the story. That's Sammy. That's me collaborating with him and him making it better. So you can consider those things. You can like sketch them out even if you can't draw, and I've tried to do this as well. Sketch it out just to see how you think it looks on the page. I don't think I talked about those panels being full tier. I may have because I wanted that almost like cinema reel style of Lon in the exact same position and the room in the same position. But you can see every choice there is specifically led to you understanding Lon on the right better. That's the whole point of this page. I want you to walk away from this page going, okay, I know her and I know how she operates. Because I can tell you she's a hit woman, but that could mean a variety of things. So right there, you should absolutely know how she operates. And then we get her looking as there's a creek behind her, and we get what we call a page turn. So the page turn means you go from one page to the next and you want to look across. So I want you to consider that while I said you should dump a lot into the gutters for your reader to engage with closure and fill in the gaps and be smarter and your story can be streamlined, control the audience. Slow them down, make them see what you need them to see, which means make them see what matters. You only need to show them what matters in a story. You do not need to really, especially in comics where page real estate is tight and you only have so much to show, you don't need to waffle on. You will lose your reader. If anyone has ever read Moby Dick, there is a phenomenal story in that book that got eaten by a whaling manual. It's really unfortunate, but you have to wade through hundreds of pages of what to do with blubber in order to get to this story with Ahab and Queequeg, and it is a ripping yarn, but it's lost, okay? I mean, it's still a classic and it's still somewhat readable, but it's not, yeah, you really got to like dive into it, and that's trusting a lot from your audience. So consider the way that you are doing those things. All right, so I want to sort of close out a bit with like, or at least this part of it, and then we can sort of talk and you can pick my brain a little bit. Metaphorically, not literally. An idea, okay? So a young woman drives to uni, and we'll call her Sarah. So when Sarah gets there, she sees a UFO in the sky, okay? And then Sarah shoots at the UFO and it flies away. So we've got character, location, world, reaction from Sarah, which tells you a little bit about her, okay? And when it tells you about her, it tells you maybe also about the world. Maybe UFOs are a little bit more common. Maybe Sarah's pretty kick-ass. She doesn't really care. I mean, she's got a gun on her. It's pretty cool. So if you think of this, not necessarily, I wouldn't call it a story idea, it's a scene. I want you to think about how you would structure it. I'll give you a moment. I'm not going to like pinpoint people and be like, you, tell me how to write this and then steal your idea, but I just want you to consider how would you structure this idea in your head? How would you see it? All right, I want you to consider, would you do this in one page? Would you do it in 2, 3? It's an opening scene, 5 pages. If you were writing it as a novel, would it just be the one chapter? Would it be half of the first chapter? If you're doing it as a movie, would it be an opening scene? I want you to consider all those things. I'm going to show you 3 options. Doing it as one page. Sarah drives on the road. We've got her in a car. Sarah steps out of her car at uni. She looks up into the sky. So we've got the car in motion and then we've got the car still. She's already stepping out and already looking up. And I'm not going to write it, you don't say to the artist, have her step out of the car and look up, because a comic panel can't have someone move around. This isn't Harry Potter with the Gazette thing, whatever it's called, with the characters moving on the front. I don't read Harry Potter, sorry. Panel 3, Sarah shoots at the UFO as it zooms away. So we don't meet this UFO until she's already shooting at it and it's zooming away. So we've taken that scene and we've truncated it into one page, okay? You can then go, oh, panel 2, oh, she was looking at a UFO. I think I get that panel now. So it's unpacked a bit as you go through the story, and that is totally fine. 3 pages. Let's unpack it a different way. Page 1, Sarah swipes up her car keys as she says farewell to her girlfriend. So we've got a little bit of character, we've got a little bit of location, and we know a bit more about her. Next panel, Sarah cruises through radio stations on her drive, each telling us more info about her world. You can do that in one panel, because you would have her hand on the radio, and you would have 4 different balloons, perhaps even with different fonts, each saying different things. Nazis won't stop kidnapping children, damn it. Godzilla rages against the world. Music stinks now and we blame millennials. Insert something else funny. And literally put that in the caption. Insert something else funny here. Like, do that. Engage with your audience if you want to. Then, panel 3, Sarah steps out of her car and we see an ominous shadow fall over her and her car. Obviously, we don't have that in motion. That's all happening at once. She stepped out of her car. There's a shadow that we can see. We don't have a shape to a shadow yet, but it's building. Panel 4, Sarah looks up. Her face looks, you can fill it in, incredulous, annoyed, worried, excited, angry. You can sort of decide. So that's just page 1. A little more granular on what it's showing you, grabbing keys, but we're also having her doing that and talking to her girlfriend, learning more about her life. Going through the radio station, so we know that she's driving, but learning a bit more about the world, because we've got space, use it. Don't just have her driving. It's a boring panel. I already showed you we could just have her there. Put it into one page if you're not going to build the world. But if you are, find a way to do it that's fun. So then she looks up. Page turn. Hopefully by the end of that page, the audience is like, what is she looking at? I bet it's flying Nazis. Let's find out! And then they turn the page. Splash page, which means one big image, okay? She looks up at a horrible bioorganic UFO. I'm thinking David Cronenberg for anyone who knows his films. The vehicle is the alien also. I would then send an email to my artist and go, I don't actually know what that looks like, but I bet you can come up with it, and maybe they do, and if they can't, maybe I change it a little bit, but I think it would look totally sweet. So we've got this idea of this weird UFO looking at her, she's looking up at it, we're all scared, but we knew we should have been at the moment we turned the page. Page 3. Sarah dives back into the car, reaching for her glove box. So we have some action and reaction. Sarah pulls out a small handgun from the glove box. So now we're learning that she's armed, so we're learning more about the character. She's rolled onto her back and she's looking up through the windscreen as she fires through it at the UFO. I would then put in a little comment. If you want to structure that differently, those first 3 panels are totally up for grabs, but that's how I would beat it out. The bullet flies up, that's poorly written, my apologies, and one wings the UFO. Dirty blood sprays into the air. A bit more emotive, tells us about this UFO. So it's giving us information. The UFO doesn't just get hit, but it's spraying dirty blood. It's kind of gross. Then the UFO flies away as Sarah stands outside the car now. Her gun clicking as it's empty of bullets, but she's still pulling the trigger. It says something about the character, doesn't it? This UFO, something that we would all be like, that's actually quite alarming. She's just like, oh, I want to kill you more. Oh, click, 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 click. You know by the end of those 3 pages a lot about her. A lot more than we could fit into that one page. We got a hint of it in one page. So maybe in that comic, the next scene unpacks her dogmatic tenaciousness in a different way. But in this one, we take 3 pages, and at the end of it, we've got the same story rolling out, but we know a bit more about her. So maybe the next scene is only 1 page. So there's different ways to do it. It's really important for me to plan that before I write it. I find I would map out a whole issue, but I would look at each scene and go, all right, how many pages do I need for this? Can I make it less pages? Can I fit as much story as possible into it? When the first issue of Beautiful Canvas came out about 2 months ago, I guess now, the reviews were phenomenal, but most of them also said, there's so much going on, I barely know what's happening, but I love it because I'm invested in the characters and I really want to know what's happening, but dear Lord, there's some amazing wild ideas going on in there. And we've got human-animal hybrid, like hit troops going on in this, we've got reactive pyrokinesis, we've got this hit woman obviously, we've got a very nasty villain who's kind of like if a tween became a Bond villain. We've got all this stuff jammed into 22 pages, and most readers were like, I feel like I need to slow down a little bit and maybe just have a cup of chamomile tea and sit in the window because it was a bit much, but I also cannot wait for more. Every review that said that, I read that and went, it's exactly what I tried to do. As the guy pulling the strings, that's exactly what I wanted. I wanted that pace. I wanted that frenetic amount of information. I wanted you invested, and I wanted you to have way more questions than answers. I love the show Lost, okay, and they constantly ask questions. They sometimes answered them, yeah, but I would rather that than just like a boring story. I don't know. I mean, there are slice of life stories that totally work. I just don't think I'm smart enough to write them, perhaps. But with something like this, or something with Sarah shooting this Cronenbergian bioorganic UFO, I feel like I could bring still an emotional core to it. So that's where I would go with it. So that's what I want you to consider. So, a new idea. A young girl is woken by a storm and she walks outside to see her parents engaged in a demonic ritual. The young girl scolds her parents for starting without her and sends them to bed to wait until dawn like she told them to. Could you tell it in one page? I think you can, 100%. Will you get everything that you know about this character? Maybe not, but hopefully your story is more than just this to that, because that's not a story, that's a scene. Could you do it in 3 pages? Could you do it in 5? If you did it in 5, what more would you be giving the reader than you would be giving them in 1 page? It's really important to consider that and to pace that out. You can have it just in 1 page, and it'll have a nice little kick, but it'll be short, but you will unpack that there's a girl, you'll unpack that there's a demonic ritual, and you'll unpack that she's kind of in charge. And you will lead a lot of questions. Why is she in charge? Wait, is she the devil? What's going on? And that's the sort of story that maybe I might write. You can unpack it in 5 pages where you get through it and she sort of comes down and she goes, you know this, I can't open the portal until I've had my Weet-Bix, damn it. And everyone's like, oh, I'm sorry, man. And then you go, oh, okay, now I've got more information. So she needs to do something. She needs to get somewhere or get something back through it. You're in charge of what you give the audience. You can give them nothing. But you've got to hope that what little you scrape out for them lures them back for more. Or you can give them everything where she stands there and says, there's an army waiting on the other side of this demonic ritual portal, and I need them to come over here so that they can kill those Nazis, and we're going to get them and ride into Godzilla's dreams, and it's going to be an amazing thing. And then the reader goes, I kind of know everything that's about to happen, at least for the next 10 pages, 20 pages, unless we sideline to a new character. So if you're going to unpack all of that, you're going to have to probably offer a twist, because if that story then involves her getting the army across and they defeat the Nazis and they chill with Godzilla, you kind of already told me that was going to happen. What needs to happen is the portal opens and she looks through and goes, Nazis already got there, well this stinks. Or she looks through there and goes, it's empty. I thought there was supposed to be an army over there. You're going to have to twist it. So the more you give them, the more of a reversal you're going to have to do. Whereas I guess maybe what I'm saying is I'm really lazy and just saying that she was going to find an army over there, so I don't even mention anything and I just have her chuck a tantrum at the start so you know she's in charge. You don't know what she's in charge of. So maybe it's a less story, but it's pieced out differently. Again, thinking of Taylor Sheridan, if you've seen Hell or High Water, which was like a modern western with Jeff Bridges and their latest film Wind River, if you plot the narrative, it's so simple. There's really just nothing to it. It's the simplest story, but it's how it's given to the reader. It's how it's presented. It's the time frames that we look at. I saw Dunkirk, really. I don't even think there is a story in there. It's phenomenal, and it looks gorgeous, but if you think of a character arc in that story, and I love Christopher Nolan, and I thoroughly enjoyed that movie, but it was how he presented that movie that mattered. Very much the same with comics. It's going to be how you present things. If you think about the pages that I've shown you throughout here, the actual drawn pages, what works in those pages and what's it getting you to feel and connect when you look at them, okay? That's what we want to bring forward in your writing. So I want you to consider this idea as a bit of a take-home. And much like all take-home homework, feel free to not do it, of course. But if you want to, go ahead and write this out as a script. And again, I'm sharing this with hopefully a bunch of emails later tonight. You can have a script format. You can see how it works, and you can say, I bet I could show this in 1 page. Am I going to use like a non-diegetic caption at the start and be like, Canberra, 2012? Because instantly the reader goes, why 5 years ago? Are we going to jump forward in time? What happened in 2012? Oh, interesting. Or you say, New York, 2001, September 7? Story's building to something else now, isn't it? It's what you give the reader. Do you want it to be full of dialogue, or do you want basically her to come out and her speech balloon to come open and there's just a demon's head in there with no words, and you go, oh, okay, I think this has something to do with her, and you let the readers engage with it more. I want you to give it a go, but by all means you don't have to. So, I'm hoping by this stage I've flooded enough of your brain with the idea of how a comic page looks as a script. If nothing else, you should walk away knowing that. You should then be thinking about, well, how do you make a comic script page become something more interesting even if you can't draw? What tricks do you use to lay it out, to use panel by panel storytelling that involves the gutters between panels and that closure? That's the second thing that I want you really coming away with. And to be honest, the third thing I want you coming away with is an actual desire to write something. And if you go home and go, comics do stink, he was right, I'm going to write this poem, go for it. If you go home and you go, that idea of jumping between panels makes me realize you could totally do that with a short film. You totally can. I'm going to give that a go, and then you write 10 screenplay pages, whatever, but I want you to actually come out of here enthused. Because if I gave you this wicked new tool of here's how a comic script looks and here's how you use guttering, and you walk away going, the writing sounds terrible because that guy was a moron, this whole session will have failed. So I hope that's not the case for anybody. Now, it's actually quite well timed to exactly what I wanted. That's going to finish me delivering. Yes, I can see you're very happy about that. So what I want to do is I want to make myself available for the next sort of half an hour to field questions based on now what I've talked about, which includes the comic industry. It's American mostly. It's actually quite European. There's an Australian scene. It's not quite an industry because it doesn't pay enough, but there's that idea. As somebody who lives in Canberra, how do you end up being a part of the comics industry? Publishing. Who do you talk to? How do you start that conversation? Where do you go? What is the publishing industry in comics? Kickstarter, which I mentioned, and I love. I've run 5 Kickstarter campaigns, all of them successful, thankfully. That's a great other avenue and something you should explore. Or whatever. We could talk about Batman, because Batman's pretty awesome. He's not as cool as Daredevil, to be honest. I think Marvel is a lot better than DC. But don't tell DC, because they just spent a lot of money teaching me how to write DC comics.